Should the Jets stick with their current group on the offensive line? Which unit is improving the most as the season progresses? Who could be traded at the trade deadline? We'll discuss all this and more on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, October 19th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free, and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. You'll get notifications as new episodes are posted. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today we have a mailbag on the 4-2 New York Jets. Each Wednesday we try and do a mailbag on the podcast. Thanks to all of the listeners who sent in questions. And our first question is about the offensive line. John, do you think the Jets should stick with their current group on the offensive line, even if when Max Mitchell and George Fant return? I think the answer is absolutely, as long as it's working. The offensive line is a spot on the field where chemistry matters a lot, because everything's happening so quickly. In a split second, you may have a stunt, you may have have to switch guys, a guy comes into your area, somebody else is looping around. There needs to be communication, there needs to be chemistry. And I've been impressed the last 2 weeks because this was a Jets group on this offensive line that has never really played together before, but they've handled everything pretty well for the most part. I mean, I think there were points in the Green Bay game where maybe the run blocking wasn't great, but it really did not matter because Breece Hall was so good he was able to work around it. But for a unit, again, that's pretty much brand new, and the Jets had to shuffle their offensive line. They've had so many alignments since training camp up front because of all the injuries. They've had to reshuffle this thing over and over. And it feels like they've kind of fallen into the right mix up front with Dwayne Brown back in the lineup at left tackle, Laken Tomlinson. Ever since Brown got back into the lineup, I think Laken Tomlinson's playing a lot better. I think he got off to a really rough start this season. It shows you how much of an impact the guy next to you can have on you. Because now suddenly with Dwayne Brown in there playing really solid football, Laken Tomlinson looks solid at the left guard position. Connor McGovern, just the steady presence at center, guy who resolved all the issues at center. In fact, if you are not a longtime listener of this podcast, the first couple of years of the history of this podcast, a lot of time was spent on me ranting about how the Jets could not figure out center because we had Wesley Johnson, we had Spencer Long, we had Jonathan Harrison, we had Ryan Khalil. It's nice the last couple of years that I have not had to complain about center. That's a big change over the last couple of years on the history of this podcast. Then at right guard, you have the waiver wire claim Nate Herbig, who I think is okay. I mean, I don't know how great he's playing, but I think he's okay. And then Elijah Vera Tucker, the guy who's moved all around the offensive line, the guy who most of us had slated for the guard position through much of his career. In fact, the Jets did too. He's been playing well at tackle. He's looked like a legitimate tackle. In this league, it's not easy to find guards. It's not easy to find anything on the offensive line these days. But it's less difficult to find a guard than it is a tackle. And if Elijah Vera Tucker keeps holding up a tackle, I say keep him there because it's a more valuable position. Not that guard isn't valuable in today's NFL. And this is a change from, 15, 20 years ago. 15, 20 years ago, it was really easy to find a guard. And guard was not a valuable position. Guard has increased in value because offensive line play is just not as good as it used to be. But tackle is still a tougher spot to fill. And if Elijah Vera Tucker can keep doing it, then you'll keep putting him out there. So listen, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And this Jets offensive line, they've been up and down through the early part of the season, but it feels like they found 5 guys who are working well together, who, despite not really having a lot of time playing together, have kind of developed good chemistry. And the offensive line is one of those spots where the sum can be greater than this. The sum can be greater than the collection of the whole, or it can be less. It's one of those spots where one weakness can destroy your line, and you can have 5 solid guys playing really well together, working well, and suddenly you have a really good unit. So I would be very hesitant to change what's going on in the offensive line. It's not bad when Fant gets healthy to have him back because, depth is always a good thing. And George Fant, I mean, looking across the league, maybe the best backup tackle in the league. And you may need him at some point because I don't know how long Dwayne Brown's going to hold up. It's been clear that he's been injured. He was on the injury report last week. He was not a full participant in practice. He's been pretty open. The fact he's playing hurt. He's got a shoulder injury. He's in his mid to late 30s. I kind of view every snap Dwayne Brown gives you as a bonus at this point because, I don't know if he's going to hold up through the course of the season. So one of the things that I always say in a situation like this, you always ask what happens when this guy's healthy. Well, sometimes these situations take care of themselves organically. Sometimes you have another injury. And if you do have another injury, it at least will be nice to have Fant and, maybe even Mitchell back at some point because it gives you a little bit more insurance. And the Jets did make a move this week. Mike Remmers was called up from the practice squad to the active roster. Connor McDermott is now gone. He was cut. So you do have another veteran tackle in the mix if you need him. I don't know how much Remmers has left in the tank, but it feels like you actually do have, to the extent you can have offensive line depth in this league, it feels like the Jets actually are decent in that area. So, but if the offensive line's playing well, if you find a mix of 5 guys who are playing effectively, don't touch it. Don't touch it until you have to, either through injury or because somebody's not playing well. Then you make a move. But don't mess around with something that's working, especially in a spot as critical as the offensive line, especially in a spot where chemistry matters as much as skill. Like, you can have 5 really talented players, but they don't play well together, your offensive line is not going to be very good. You got 5 guys on this offensive line, all of whom are decent players, but all of whom are playing really well together. So, I'm not touching it. Next question. What game do you reckon will finally earn the privilege of a Nance Romo broadcast? That's the number 1 team on CBS. Well, a couple things. First of all, Jets got the number 1 team this past week. They got the Fox number 1 team of Kevin Burkhardt and Greg Olsen. So, the last couple of years, we've had like the bottom of the CBS lineup when it comes to broadcasters. This week we have Iron Eagle. What's wrong with Iron Eagle? I think Iron Eagle's pretty good. He's my favorite. I'm a little biased, but Iron Eagle's my favorite, so I'm not complaining about that. It could happen next week. I was looking at the schedule. Jets Patriots next week. I was looking at, there aren't really a lot of compelling games, and another factor in this is CBS only has regional coverage next week. So the way this works in the NFL broadcasting, CBS and Fox, each week one network has a doubleheader. So here it's a doubleheader Sunday. That means they have a game at 1 o'clock and they have a game at 4:30. There's also regional coverage. So each week, one of the 2 networks has a doubleheader. The other has what's known as regional coverage, where they're showing either an early afternoon game or a late afternoon game, but not both. Next week, CBS has regional coverage, which means there's no... And if you have a doubleheader, typically your featured game with the number 1 team is the 4:30 game. So, that's the game Nance and Romo call. It's the game Burkhardt and Olsen call. If the network has a doubleheader, the number 1 team's going to be on the 4:30 game. It's going to be the best game the network has all day. When it's regional coverage, the number 1 team doesn't have as many options. And looking through the schedule next week, it could be Jets Patriots because I don't see a lot of other, especially if the Jets win. I don't see a lot of other compelling matchups. Although again, I'm biased. I love Iron Eagle, so I have no objection to getting Iron Eagle like we will have this week. There's another factor. There's something that comes into play during games that I think people kind of miss. And I noticed this on the Sauce Gardner interception on the first series that he returned for the touchdown that was overruled on replay. But the top broadcast teams and Fox and CBS, they have a higher production budget than the lower tier broadcast teams. And that can come into play. I think that actually kind of came into play in the Jets-Packers game because a higher production budget means that you get more cameras there. You have more camera angles. And that really comes into play on replays. And I was thinking as watching that Sauce Gardner interception get overturned because it seemed like the definitive angle was kind of a weird camera angle. And it's probably like a camera angle only the number 1 team has. And I was thinking, if this was like like kind of like the 5th team on CBS, I'm not sure they have that camera angle because their production budget isn't as big. They don't have as many cameras there. And that's the way it works. The number 1 team on the network gets the most camera angles. The primetime games have a ton of camera angles. Once you get to the playoffs and the Super Bowl, I mean, the budget increases, so you have an angle for pretty much everything. And I think sometimes we forget, like sometimes we lose track. That can actually impact a game, because the more camera angles you have, the more replay angles there are if a play needs to be reviewed. And that I was wondering myself watching that game on Sunday whether that Sauce Gardner interception stands if it's, again, the number 5 team on C. Just kind of an interesting thought that I had. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue our weekly mailbag. The trade deadline's not that far away, and there are a couple of Jets players rumored to be on the block. Will the Jets make a deal? I'll tell you what I think as we continue this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. The Jets are 4-2. They're looking to go 5-2 this weekend in Denver. What's been responsible for the turnaround? Well, above all else, they've increased their talent level on this team. They've done it through the draft. They've done it through free agency. Lots of high-stakes moves that are paying off. When your business is hiring, it's also a high-stakes move for you. In fact, every potential hire can feel like one for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. And that's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster, and it's for free. You add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. They have simple tools like screening questions that make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and to hire. And it's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Again, that's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and it's available on all platforms. We continue with our weekly mailbag. Our next question: there is a lot of talk about trading depth players such as Denzel Mims and Bryce Hall by the deadline. The expected returns are late-round picks. These are talented guys that provide the type of depth the Jets have not had in years. The roster finally seems good enough where 5th to 7th round picks will struggle to make the 53-man roster. Would you trade either player for that type of return, or are you in the mode of quality over quantity in the draft? Well, when it comes to the draft, I'm for both, because the best way to find quality is to have a quantity of picks. But we're talking about two specific players here. We're talking Bryce Hall. We're talking Denzel Mims. This is my read on the situation. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is my read. I think the Jets view both of these players as legitimate backups. And that's why I think if Denzel Mims could have been traded for a 5th to 7th round pick, he would have been traded. I don't think the Jets have any interest in trading him. The reports have been that a 4th round pick was the price for Denzel Mims. I would imagine the same is true of Bryce Hall, although it seems like the Jets are a little bit down on Bryce Hall. You heard rumblings during the offseason that maybe the Jets were not crazy about Bryce Hall. He's been inactive since that first game when he got beat for that touchdown by Devin Duvernay. Still, though, I think the Jets like their depth. I think that both of these guys are viewed as good depth players for this team. So it's kind of like the mix, right? You're trying to balance what's good for your team right now versus the long-term versus the long-term vision. So I feel like, and I've studied this to a certain extent, picks round 5 through round 7, they're really not super valuable. In fact, I've seen a lot of data that suggests that these picks, the expected outcome for a pick round 5 through round 7, not that different from an undrafted free agent you'd sign. So, it's helpful. I'd rather have extra picks in the late rounds than not have them, because essentially a pick round 5 through round 7, it guarantees you get the undrafted free agent you want. Because when we're talking about signing undrafted free agents, once the draft ends, those guys can sign with any team. Whereas if you draft somebody, they have to come to you. So essentially it gives you a chance to make sure you get the undrafted free agent level player you want. But I don't know that it adds a ton of surplus value to your team, because these guys' late round picks, they very rarely pan out. So for what I've seen, the relevant portion of the draft ends somewhere like maybe halfway to 2/3 of the way through the 4th round. That's about the point where you can get quality. You at least have a decent chance of getting quality players. And I think the Jets view both of these guys as good backups to have. So, if you're getting a 5th through 7th round pick for these guys, you're kind of giving away your depth and you're not getting a whole lot in return. Whereas if you get an earlier pick, you get a pick round 4, maybe even round 3, then yeah, you're hurting your depth. Maybe you're in the short term, but you could be helping your team in the long run. And the trade-off could be worth it, because the balance of depth is that you typically don't need it. So typically you're not giving it away. Of course, when you need it, when a guy gets injured, you're really grateful when you have it. At the same time, are you willing to risk giving away that depth if you can get something that really will help your team in return in the future? So if we're talking round 3, round 4, I think that's probably where the line would be. I would not trade pick, fifth, or I would not trade these guys for a pick round 5 or later, because you're not really getting anything in return. But if you got like a 4th round pick, I think definitely a 3rd round pick I'd trade either of these guys for, because even though you're rolling the dice, you're reducing your depth, you're getting something that could really help your team in the future, and it's probably worth the risk. But you're not. I just view you're giving these guys away if you're getting a late round pick for them. So I don't see the value in that. I mean, if you're trading somebody for a 5th round pick, then you've just decided you're done with them and you're getting what you can for them. And I don't think there's that degree of urgency with either of these players where the Jets just have to give them away for anything they can get. I think these guys are fine to have as backups, because you're one injury away from maybe them stepping into the lineup and seeing some legitimate playing time. Next question. 3 maligned units this year have been safety, tight end, and linebacker. Have they played better lately to consider any a success at this point? Do you feel we have any building blocks in place at these positions to carry us into the future? So I think 2 of the 3, the answer is yes, they're playing better. I think safety play has been a lot better the last 3 weeks. And that's one of the reasons I think the Jets have won 3 straight games. Is the safety play, which was catastrophic early in the season between Whitehead and Joyner, has really stabilized. And I don't know if it's going to continue going forward, because these are both guys who are very up and down. So, I mean, there could be another slump around the way. But I think the safety position has gotten a lot better. I think you're seeing much, and it started in that Pittsburgh game when Joyner and Whitehead both could have had 2 interceptions. But I really like what the Jets have done at safety the last couple of weeks. Linebacker, I thought they played well against Green Bay. Quincy Williams was really good in his return to the lineup. Mosley had like a throwback CJ Mosley game. Other than that, linebackers have been struggling, though. I think Quincy Williams was bad up to that point before the injury. Mosley, I think as recently as Miami I thought he had an awful game against Miami. The only linebacker who I thought was playing well was Quan Alexander, but Jets played better. Now, I think Quincy Williams, he's a guy who's going to be up and down because he's so aggressive that there are going to be games where he just delivers big hit after big hit because he's so aggressive, but there are also going to be awful games where he just runs himself out of plays, and these linebackers really can't cover. So I think linebackers going to be up and down. Tight end, I mean, it's better from the standpoint that there was only one way to go. There was no... It was going to be impossible to sustain play that bad the Jets got from the tight end position the first 3 weeks. I mean, it's impossible to be that bad through the course of the whole season. But, I mean, they're not any good. These tight ends are awful. These tight ends have been terrible. And they're not getting any better. They're bad. And it amazes me because I was thinking about this. 2 years ago, the Jets were a hopeless team. They had no talent anywhere. And over the course of these 2 years, they have spent resources at practically every position. And they've upgraded everywhere. And they threw a ton of resources at tight end. And it's like the one spot they can't figure out. It's like, doesn't matter what they do at tight end. They can't get anything better at there. And it's kind of funny because now the Jets are winning, so it's not really impacting them. But tight ends have been awful this year. Conklin and Uzama, especially Conklin. It's one thing for Uzama and not really help the team. Conklin, at least, this week, Green Bay, there was nothing egregious, but Conklin goes out there and makes 1 or 2 plays a week that kill the team, that just destroy the team. Whether it's a penalty, a drop, a fumble. This guy's actively going out there hurting the team. It's almost the way Conklin's played this year. It would almost be better to go 10 on 11. And and people are pointing at his numbers. I feel like Conklin is a good test for whether you've watched the Jets this year or whether you're just looking at the numbers. Because you look at the numbers, it's oh, he's having a decent season. Of course, if you've watched the Jets, you know all that production has been when the Jets have been behind by multiple touchdowns in the second half, and he's just been compiling stats on checkdowns when the defense is playing 10 yards off him. It's been, these tight ends, they make me yearn for the golden days of Ryan Griffin and Wesco. So the tight ends have been dreadful. The tight ends, there's been nothing redeeming about them. They've been horrific. Safety's been better. Linebacker showed some promise last game. So, 2 of the 3. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out our weekly mailbag. We'll talk about how the Jets can get their wide receivers going. Some talented young guys, Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, not producing a whole lot. What needs to happen? I'll tell you what I think as we close out this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Would you believe the Jets are underdogs again this weekend? Doesn't matter how many games they win. Doesn't matter who the opponent is. Doesn't seem like the odds makers give the Jets a lot of respect. Of course, if you're a Jets fan who's been betting on them, that's been good news for you because you've done pretty well the last couple of weeks. If you want to put more money down on the Jets this weekend as they travel to Denver, you should know that BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your football betting info this season. You can find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find, including Jets Denver this weekend, along with all the other NFL games, and also Major League Baseball playoffs. The NBA opening night was last night. NHL's underway, MMA, boxing, golf. BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. Just head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question, John, what do the Jets need to do to get Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson involved in the game? It seems like they have struggled in the first half, and a lot of it could be cured with getting the football to talented wideouts. Is this a play calling issue? Are these guys not getting open, or is Zach Wilson missing them? I think more than anything, the Jets have just become a run-oriented offense. They threw the ball less than 20 times in Green Bay, and there just are so many targets to go around. And that's the reason, I think that above all else is the reason these guys aren't really producing. I was kind of struck by Elijah Moore not getting any catches against Green Bay, so I went back and watched everything. He was a guy I focused on the film, and he's playing fine. I mean, I'm looking at him. He's getting open frequently. And it's not even a Zach Wilson thing. It's just his number's not really being called. I watched every Jets passing play that includes, plays on penalties that were wiped out. It includes plays where there was a sack. I could not find a single play where Elijah Moore was the number one option in the passing game. And I think one thing that's kind of encouraging, it seemed like on key downs against Green Bay, Zach Wilson was looking to Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson was the guy he wanted to find. So we know that the two of them, they missed a lot of time because Garrett Wilson was playing with the number twos in training camp a lot. And then Zach Wilson suffered his injury, and it felt like the connection was not there early. It's still not entirely there, but it feels like Zach Wilson's gaining more trust in Garrett Wilson. But, I'm watching these guys play. I just feel like their quality of play is still pretty high. And it's just a matter of time before they get going. And really the number one reason is that the Jets have been ahead, and they've been able to work the run game in these games. And when you're only throwing the ball like 20 times a game, I mean, there are only so many touches to go around because, Corey Davis has to get his share. You're going to have a certain number of plays that go to the running backs. I don't know why, but they're still going to throw to the tight ends. I mean, maybe they shouldn't do that, but the tight ends are still going to see a share of action, as ill-advised as that may be. But, there just aren't many targets to go around when you're a run-oriented offense. And the Jets really should be a run-oriented offense because Breece Hall looks great. So, I don't think there's anything. I think that, you'd like to see the connections improve a little bit. I mean, Zach Wilson can probably help this, but I think the receivers are playing fine, to be honest with you. I was kind of interested, so that was one of the things I keyed in when I watched the film in the Packers game. And I left it feeling like they're going to be okay at receiver. It's just a matter of time before it gets going. You get receiver play, that's decent receiver play the Jets are getting. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And you have to remember, the team's winning, so it's working. What they're doing isn't, the first half against Green Bay on offense wasn't very good, but it's not a bad situation. I think that what they're getting at the receiver position is perfectly fine. I think Elijah Moore, I think Garrett Wilson, these guys are solid, and you're going to be fine with them. Our last question, how much of the Jets' strong defensive performance was due to Rodgers' injured thumb? It appeared to me he was missing basic, easy completions, kind of like Zach 2021. Rodgers never misses these. This does not negate the defensive line's stellar performance. Two seemingly contradictory things can be true at the same time. Yeah, listen, Rodgers was not 100% in that game. He missed throws. And frankly, Green Bay's passing attack without Devontae Adams, it kind of lacks a big play element at the receiver position. It's always a mix when you win. It's always a mix of what you do well and the opponent does poorly. When the Jets lose, we always focus on what the Jets did badly, but sometimes we forget there's another team out there trying to win. The other team frequently does a good job. It's always a mix of these things. I think it was more the Jets, though. I thought the Jets were great on defense, and I thought it was more the defensive line. And listen, against the compromised Rodgers, when a guy's not feeling so well at the quarterback position, you want to hit him frequently. You want to make him feel uncomfortable, and the Jets did that. They took advantage of the situation that was in front of them. I don't think you give back wins because the other team wasn't at 100%. Yeah, listen, that's part of the story of the game. It's absolutely true that Rodgers was not 100%, and that needs to be viewed in the proper context, just as all these other wins have done. But the Jets completed the task that was in front of them. And listen, the Jets dominating on the defensive line, that was independent of what was happening with Rodgers. What Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed are doing to those receivers, that's independent of what was happening with Rodgers. I think, Green Bay probably scores more points if there's a healthy Rodgers. I think the Jets still win the game, though. I thought it was a great performance by the Jets. I thought almost everybody on defense looked great in that game. And I think even, against better opponents, fine, they may score more than 10 points, but they're not going to score a lot more than 10 points if the Jets play like that. I thought it was an outstanding performance by the Jets. And, Rodgers missed some throws. Rodgers was not 100%. And of course, that's fair. It's fair to point out, but let's give the Jets a lot of credit, because I thought that defense was phenomenal, regardless of what was happening with Rodgers. They were in his face all game. They were locking down the receivers. Excellent performance by the Jets. And part of the story is always what the other team did not do when you win, but a big part of that story, I think a bigger part, was what the Jets did right. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. You'll get notifications as new episodes are posted. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. It helps us out tremendously, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. So does giving this episode a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.